Welcome to week 15 and welcome to 2015, you guys. So, I will be presenting the class notes each week in a screencast format, and I'll still be putting them up here so you guys can access them yourself and you can download them and add your own notes as we go. The way I recommend using this is to basically follow along the screencast and maybe take some notes of your own as we go. And some weeks it's going to be longer than others. This week it's going to be fairly short, it's just kind of a review. So however you want to use the notes is up to you. So what we're going to be doing this whole spring semester is dedicated to understanding marine life, which I know a lot of you are going to be very excited to start doing. And before we do that, we need to do some review of some really essential elements of biology, specifically a review of evolution and natural selection. It's really hard to understand why we have the biodiversity that we have, why we have so many different species of so many different things, unless we understand how they got that way and why they're here. And that is largely answered by understanding concepts of evolution. So you might remember if you've taken biology what evolution is. We're basically talking about genetic change over time. And so that's essentially the definition of the word evolution as it pertains to biology, is genetic change over time. And when we're talking about genetics, we're talking about genes and their expression. And so the expression of genes is basically explaining the variation that we see among all living things. You have different genes than your best friend or your next door neighbor that you're not related to, and that explains the physical differences we see between you. So where we get these genes, here's a little diagram that kind of reviews this. If you remember, every cell has a nucleus within it, and the nucleus contains chromosomes. And those chromosomes are basically little bundles of genes. So if we take a chromosome, it's almost like if you take a rubber band and you twist it a lot, and you end up with this little sort of a bundle of rubber bands and little circles, all kind of bundled together. So that's essentially what we see with a chromosome. So if we unwind it, then we have eventually a strand of DNA. So you'll recognize the DNA double helix. And a gene is basically a segment of DNA. And that segment of DNA is described by a code, a genetic code. So if we look over here at this diagram, if we look at, this is kind of a more descript map of a chromosome, and each little line represents a different set of genes. If we were to look more closely at those genes, we would see that we've basically given them symbols, little letters as symbols to represent the genetic code. So a gene is basically a segment of these symbols, represented A, T, C, or G. And so these codes basically cause the expression of all the physical traits, all the behavioral traits that we see in living things and individuals. So these letters are going to be known as alleles. Okay, the alleles, the combination of alleles is basically how the genes are expressed. So if we continue here, what we want to know, why are we concerned about this? Why are we concerned about chromosomes? Well, we're going to see that from one generation to the next, some of those genes might be expressed differently or not at all, and that can cause the genetic change that we see in an individual. So basically, chromosomes are reduced in the process of meiosis. So meiosis, if you remember, is basically the making of gametes, and that's basically eggs and sperm, the sex cells of living things. So in meiosis, so this is a little review of meiosis. I'll let you look at it in more detail. I won't go over every step here. But the stages of meiosis are a process of basically taking a pair of chromosomes and splitting them up. So we have pairs of chromosomes here. We've split them up. We've divided them into individual chromosomes in the gametes. So what we have here at the bottom, these 4 cells are egg or sperm, and they contain half of the chromosomes that we see in the original cell. And so when the egg and sperm combine during fertilization, so we take one of these and we combine them with somebody else's gamete, then we end up with 2 again. We end up with pairs of chromosomes instead of just the one little individuals we see here. So here's one, and here's one, and then here's another individual. So when we pair them up, we end up with a complete individual. And you have inherited a chromosome from mom and a chromosome from dad, and so you get all of your chromosomes as a combination of genes from both parents. So in this process, new gene sequences are produced. So remember, the alleles refer to the sequence of genes, those A, T, C's, and G's. And with sexual reproduction, that's basically chromosomes from two parents are combined. You have the potential for a lot of different combinations of genes. For this to happen, of course, mating is required. Why do we say that? Why is that relevant? Well, if you look at organisms that reproduce asexually, like bacteria, for example, they don't have to find someone else to reproduce and pass on their genes. They just have to split themselves in half. And that's a lot easier. And so mating is required, which is actually can be a challenge. It takes a lot of energy to make these gametes. And the payoff is that there's a lot of genetic variation. And why is that important? Why does that help organisms or species? Well, it's a higher ability to adapt to their environment. So if there's more different combinations of genes in a population, then there's a higher likelihood that some of those genes are going to be really well suited to surviving changes in the environment. And so that makes them more adaptable. So a difference between asexual and sexual reproduction. So here on the left is asexual. So this is pretty simple. The little organism just splits itself in half, and now it's a new organism. Or it's two new organisms, two daughter, or I guess you could say son, offspring. With sexual reproduction, you have males and females that have to combine their genes to create a new individual. So with asexual reproduction, one parent needed high offspring turnout, so you have the potential to reproduce much faster, more quickly. You've got a lot more offspring that can occur. Organisms don't need to find another mate to reproduce, and the offspring are always genetically identical to a parent. So ask yourself, why might that be an advantage or a disadvantage when we look at evolution? No genetic variation unless we have mutations. So let's review mutations real quick. When people think of mutations, they often think of something out of X-Men, some crazy three-headed monster or something with superpowers, and that's really not what we're talking about. Mutations happen constantly. You have mutations. I have mutations. We all have mutations in our genetic code somewhere. The big thing is that most of the time those mutations don't really change much about you. They don't change much about your behavior or physical appearance. But sometimes they do, either for good or for bad. So there are a few types of mutations, if you remember. A chromosomal mutation is where a part of the chromosome is missing. A point mutation is basically where when DNA is coding and being copied, if you remember this during DNA replication, one of the alleles is basically one of the nucleotides, so the A's, T's, C's, or G's, instead of making another T, it makes a G, so you have a point mutation. You have something that is copied wrong. An expansion is where you have a sequence. So here's a gene where you have a sequence of 3 nucleotides. And it's almost like, when you send a text message to somebody and then you find out that text message sent like 3 or 4 times instead of just once. You get a copy of 3 or 4 of those text messages. And that's kind of what's happening with expansion. So instead of duplicating these 3 genes exactly, it makes more copies. So you have more than what you needed. So we've reviewed mutation. We've reviewed kind of what genes are and where they exist in the cell and what they do. So some terminology that's important. If we're talking about an organism's traits on a gene level, we're talking about its genotype. So what your genes say about you is your genotype. On the physical level, so basically how those genes are manifested, is your phenotype. So why are these things different and why do we need to make a distinction between them? We're going to see as we keep going. So we apply changes in genetic code over time and we have evolution. So remember, it's just genetic change over time. But more specifically, it's the change in the expression of specific genes over time, primarily due to natural selection. So what we're talking about here is how some genes are going to be inherently more favorable to conditions in the environment. Other genes are going to not be favorable or even cause problem for the organism. So environmental factors can affect this. They can affect the rate of change. For example, if there's a major catastrophic event like a volcano that wipes out a whole area, maybe some organisms are going to have genes that make them better suited to dealing with the new environment than others. So here we're going to divide a gene pool, and you're going to see this distinction. So here's some fish. They're in literally a gene pool. Of course, I mean a lake, and I'm not talking about a swimming pool. Gene pool just means the group of genes within a population. So here's a group of fish. And let's say that there's some kind of disaster, an earthquake or something, that causes a barrier between them. So the lake is now separated. Maybe the building of a dam, by humans. And now they're separated. We got two different populations now that don't intermix. They can't find each other or get to each other. And maybe, let's say, on one side of the lake, it's more shadow, and on the other side, it's usually in full daylight. There's some difference between the two populations now. Basically, they're going to be changing differently to adapt to those conditions over time. So maybe we look at those populations, several generations later. Maybe we remove that barrier. Maybe they take down the dam. We might find that the populations are so genetically different that they're not interbreeding anymore. Maybe they can't interbreed. So now basically what we're looking at is the allele frequencies. The frequencies of certain genes are going to be different from one population to the other. And the alleles have basically specialized for the different conditions in each of the two ponds. So that's kind of one example of how, even though evolution itself, when we think of evolution and we think of organisms changing over time, it takes a long time. For example, we talk about our early ancestors that we share with modern day apes. That ancestor didn't happen over the course of 2 or 3 generations, and we did not descend from that ancestor over 1 or 2 generations. This happened over a long time. But that having been said, small differences like this can happen very quickly over only a few generations. So evolution as a whole process takes a long time. But natural selection, which is where we have some genes being selected for and some genes being selected against, can happen pretty quickly. So when we talk about new species evolving, let's just kind of review what a species is anyway. What is a species? There's a few definitions of a species, and it can get kind of problematic, actually. There's the typological definition. It's basically what is a species just based on what it looks like. And of course, there's obvious problems with this. Looks aren't everything. One example of that is a concept called sexual dimorphism. So that's where males and females morphologically look very different. They don't look the same. In these fish examples, like here's a female anglerfish. If you can believe this, the male is this little tiny thing down here attached to her. That is the male, and this is the female. So if you looked at them, you would not think they're the same species. So looks alone can be deceiving. The modern definition is based more on genotypes. So what is a species? Well, we look at their genes, who has like genes or similar genes. So in this definition, a species is a population or populations of organisms that interbreed and are reproductively isolated from other populations. So they interbreed with each other and they can't interbreed with other populations. We describe this through what's called reproductive isolation. So basically, when members of a species are incapable of breeding with other species, they're considered reproductively isolated, and that's one way we know that they are in fact distinct species. There's a few mechanisms that can cause this, either habitat isolation, so maybe they're geographically too far away to breed, anatomical isolation, and that's where basically their sex organs just can't come together, so they physically can't breed. Behavioral isolation, maybe their reproductive behaviors are so different that they don't recognize each other, or like one of them is doing a mating dance and the other one just does not understand what's going on. So their behaviors don't match up. And then there's temporal isolation. Basically, their reproduction occurs at different times of the year. So maybe their mating seasons are so different that they never align so that they don't breed together. And then there's biochemical isolation. So maybe they can mate, they do get together. All of these other things are not a factor. But then once that happens, their gametes can't come together. Their gametes aren't compatible. So let's say that fertilization does occur, that the gametes do fuse. We can actually have something called hybrid offspring, where you have basically two different species that can have an offspring. And this is rare, but it's really kind of fantastic if you think about it. A mule is one example. A mule is the combination between a horse and a donkey. And those are two different species that are just genetically similar enough that they can have this offspring, but the offspring is sterile, meaning the offspring itself cannot reproduce. This is a liger, a lion-tiger. Same thing. We can actually get a lion and a tiger to mate, but their offspring is not capable of reproducing. This is a wholphin. It is a bottlenose dolphin and a false killer whale. So those are examples of how you can have sometimes two species mate, but their offspring are not fertile or they are sterile, and so therefore they're separate species.